Welcome to Coexisting with COVID-19 and the final episode of this fall. I'm your host, Hanson Hossein, co-founder of the University of Washington, frankly, a time of crisis. Special thanks to these entities for our support. In this episode, stand up and be counted. Until I started preparing for this particular episode, I hadn't realized how much your viewing volume, turn on closed captioning on YouTube, and email us your questions. Here to help us answer this fundamental conversation and this question about she teaches and writes in the area of constitutional law, election law, and presidential powers. As a law school graduate myself, I'm especially impressed that Lisa has clerked both at the United States Court of Appeals and at the U.S. Supreme Court. Sara Curran is director of the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology at the University of Washington. Her research examines the relationship between demographic dynamics and economic development, among other areas. I've known Sara since I joined the UW, and I'm pleased she'll share her expertise with all of us on the census in this episode. Reminder, if you have any questions for our experts, you email at any time to mayiask@uw.edu, and I'll try to incorporate those questions as I lead this conversation. Sara, Lisa, and Michele, thanks for joining me at this crucial time.
Thank you.
So Michele, I start with you as a former UW faculty, but now on the front lines of a lot of this. What impact do you see the pandemic having on this crucial necessary for counting, whether it's the election or the census?
Right. So let's start with the census. The census is absolutely critical. Tell us who should be our representatives in Congress. It tells us what federal resources should go into communities. So it's critical that people participate. While it was intended that this be done online this year anyway, we still had interruptions due to COVID-19. Pay attention to going online, and even though it only takes about 7 minutes to fill out this census. So COVID-19 absolutely has an impact on this census. And then I think as to voting, the thing that is complicated is, again, voting, cornerstone of our democracy, right? It's extremely important that everyone does it, but people should not have to choose between their health and their voting. So how people vote this year is greatly impacted by COVID-19. And I know we'll have the chance to say more about this as the program proceeds.
Well, that's a great summary, and thanks for establishing that foundation for us, Michele. Lisa, you have focused so much on the importance of our institutions and how they're backed up by our laws and Constitution. What impact has the pandemic had on those particular traditional institutions of ours?
Well, when I think about the different problems that society face, and then I consider the pandemic, one way of conceptualizing the pandemic is as sort of a multiplier. In a sense, it takes the pre-existing problems that we have, and then it tends to multiply their effects. And certainly this is true with respect to a number of different institutions and the challenges they're facing. One that I think makes sense to focus on is election administration. And by that, I'm really referring to how we run the elections that then count people's votes. And to be clear, election administration is always a bit of a mess. It's just not possible to implement a system where you're counting millions of people's ballots that are all being cast at more or less the same time. And what's made that process worse over the last, I would say, 10 years or so, is that sometimes what you'll have is that you'll have the people in power actually trying to take advantage of some of those challenges and some of those complications in election administration in an effort to actually make it harder for eligible voters to cast a ballot and have it counted. So in a sense, that what the pandemic has done in this context is it's taken that large collection of pre-existing problems and it's made them worse.
Got it. Well, Sara, you've heard Lisa say that there are entities that would like to take advantage of these challenges when it comes to the census and the elections. And we heard Michele also speak about her concerns around what should have been an easy thing. What's really going on here? What's your concern about the census?
Well, there are a couple things, and as Lisa mentioned, there are multiplier effects. One piece is that the census always, for several decadal censuses, has been a challenge with funding issues, and that became even more starkly apparent when COVID hit. And the second is, as Michele mentioned, there's been this back and forth administrative changes around when the field operations will start and stop, And that had happened in April. It happened again where they were reopened in May. They've now just aimed to, they thought we were going to be working on collecting field operations through October. Now it's been changed to September. As Lisa mentioned, people take advantage of this notion of uncertainty around the quality of the data, and there are significant response work was stopped, started up again, is stopping early. And we have fairly high numbers. In Alaska, 44% of
existing societal fissures. You have been focused on a lot of Black Lives Matter issues. Why are certain, what's motivating people to take advantage of this pandemic to mess around with the census and the elections? How much does race play a factor into this?
Well, I don't want to try to say what people's motivations are, but let me tell you what the implications are, right? So just as an example, in 2010, we have reason to believe that 9% of Black people in this country were simply missed, right, in the count. And Sara already referenced marginalized communities, rural communities, Native communities, where it is really hard to get that data anyway. And then on top of that, as you know, this year, there was an attempt by the administration to add a citizenship question to the census. Now that has a chilling effect on people who are concerned, regardless of whether or not they are a citizen, are concerned about whether that information would be given to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and so forth. And so there's this chilling effect. So now we have the potential of people being afraid to fill out the census, even though the Supreme Court of the United States did rule, no, there will be no citizenship question, and there is no citizenship question on the census, right? But it has had a massive chilling effect. So what happens when we undercount people of color, right? What happens is, because again, the census helps us allocate representatives in government. It helps us to identify federal funding for healthcare and roads and schools and what kind of assets go into a given community. So when those communities are not counted, they do not get the resources that they need to live with freedom, liberty, and justice for all. And that's the impact. And that's what we need to be very concerned about. And why we've been very active at the ACLU in encouraging people to fill out the census, even if they feel nervous about it, because we need those funds and those resources and the representation in government to go into those communities.
Lisa, as we listen to Michele's concerns about this, and as you consider the case law around presidential powers and election law, how much of what's happening now is an aberration, or is it actually part of a continuum of something that we've been seeing for years in this country?
I think that's quite hard to answer. And in part because whatever develops at a given time on the one hand is part of a process and then part of a series of developments that's been going on for a very long time. And on the other hand, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. For example, we don't know what's going to happen in November. We don't know what's going to happen in January. So it's sort of hard to say exactly where our current moment fits in. That being said, if we circle back to the question of race, if you think about the overlap of race and voting rights, and now the pandemic as sort of a multiplier, it really becomes very clear very quickly that in the United States, since the very beginning, race and voting rights have been inseparable. And actually, if you look to the history of race and voting rights in the country, it does give us some perspective with respect to what we're seeing right now. I know it can be hard to remember this, given all the different things that are going on right now, but things have definitely been worse in this country, at least from the perspective of race and elections. That being said, one of the features of the sort of current manifestations of the way that race and elections overlap right now is that often the racial components will overlap with political party affiliation as well as with geographical residence. And by that, I mean that a lot of the unfairness that people of color tend to face with respect to elections now gets packaged up as though it's actually about Democrats or it's actually about urban voters. And so if you have, we could talk about specific sort of issues. I mean, there are something like, I think 300 cases right now working through the courts, sort of challenging different election-related laws that are governing how things progress. But what you'll find is that if you challenge something that an election administrator has done, say if in Texas you challenge the state's decision to shut down polling places over the last 5-10 years in areas where there's rising Latino and Black populations, if you say, hey, I think that's illegal because I think you did that in a way that's racially discriminatory, what you'll have is the election administrator swear up and down, this has nothing to do with race, this was just about logistics. And if you don't believe that, then the administrator will say, well, okay, well, it was actually just really about geography. If you say don't believe that, then they'll say, well, actually, it was just about politics. We were just trying to make it harder for people of this political persuasion to vote. But the fact remains that everyone at least knows, and like with Michele, I can't say what people's subjective motivations are, but the fact remains that everyone knows that a lot of these different measures affect people of color in disproportionate ways. So we are seeing that manifestation of sort of these problems. That's the genre of it that we're seeing these days.
Sara, as we heard from Lisa, the battle lines have clearly been drawn, even if people won't admit very directly to why these battles are happening. Michele talking about the undercount of people of color. When you think about the integrity of the census and why we have censuses in the first place, what impact or what are the implications when we do have that kind of undercount when it comes to how we govern and what those numbers mean for us?
Well, I think the implications are pretty profound. And the Census Bureau for years and years has tried very hard. I mean, I'm not saying it's not political, but has tried very hard to ensure that there is integrity around data storage, that nobody can use these data for nefarious purposes. We don't want to have an incident, the kinds of incidences that happened after, during World War II, right before World War II, where we had Japanese internment, and part of that was about using census data to identify Japanese communities in America. And that whole experience led to amendments to statutory laws around requiring protection of confidentiality of people's data. What's happened in the last 3 years has been a pretty concerted attempt to suggest that census data might be used to identify particular kinds of people. In fact, just in July, the president issued a memo saying that he wanted to have apportionment counts that excluded undocumented migrants from the count. That's just not how the census works. The census is about counting all residents. And the distribution of resources, as Michele described, is all about distributing resources to everybody who lives in the United States. I mean, distributing to states and to localities based on the total number of people residing in that place. And I won't go into, there have been for years questions around how do we measure race, how do we measure ethnicity, and those every decade, those are often problematic, challenging political decisions. And one could say, in some cases, it's empowering if we can count more people of more diversity and account for and see more diversity in our country. That can be an empowering thing, as long as we aren't targeting those people for the wrong reasons, right? So this is where we have this challenge of counting people for what purpose. And the ideals supposedly of the census in the establishment of democracies was to empower people. Censuses have been going on for thousands, millennia of years. For the most part, censuses were used by governments to tax people, to confiscate property, and to conscript people into the military. It wasn't until you had the Enlightenment and you had this idea of democracy that started to emerge, where you began to see the notion of a census as more of a relationship between the people being governed and the government, and more empowering. That said, still a political process, and raising doubts about the quality of the count then leads to all sorts of court challenges, and we'll just be in a forever cycle of not actually doing the work of governing and not actually progressing as a society.
Got it. Well, Michele, things sound pretty dire on a federal level. How much can we here in Washington State, with our mail-in ballots and our relatively sedate political culture, pat ourselves on the back for what's going on here?
Oh, was that for me?
Yeah.
So look, it is great. We have had mail-in ballots in Washington State for, I don't even know how long anymore. I'm completely so used to it. I don't even remember when I used to go to a polling place. And not too long ago, our Secretary of State did a study to identify the safety and security of it. And is there any fraud? And the amount of fraud was just infinitesimal, right? It was just like didn't even register. So we're fortunate that way. We know we can do that. And as long as we keep the Postal Service alive, we can mail in our ballots. I mean, we've been so dedicated to safe voting in Washington that you no longer have to put a stamp on it, right? And there's ballot boxes in numerous places around the states. You don't even have to drop it off at a postal box. So that's helpful. I think we're in decent shape because of that. And while we may not be as politically divided in Washington as other places, I am going to say, sadly, I think that the divisions that we see on the national scale do impact us here as well.
Yeah. So Lisa, concerns around voter fraud, the post office. I mean, we heard from Michele that Washington State is less of a concern, but still a concern. When you look at what the court cases have brought forward and what we're seeing happen right now, what has been the general level of concern around voter fraud, and how has it been addressed in this country until now?
Sure. So one thing that you asked, how is Washington sort of compared to other jurisdictions? And one thing to note in Washington is not only that, almost in a little bit of an accident, we have universal mail-in voting at exactly the time when you want universal mail-in voting. So we have that going for us. But then also we have a sort of a history, a tradition of election administration in this state that is, even though it's nominally partisan, for example, our Secretary of State is Republican, it functions in a fairly nonpartisan manner, pretty cooperative manner. We have our Secretary of State's office has a good, long-standing relationship with the United States Postal Service. Our Secretary of State actually got on national news and started, you could sort of feel like it's a little bit like the president kind of stepped on her turf a little bit by saying, there's all these threat of fraud when it comes to mail-in voting, and she started going on, national news saying, wait a second, I've worked on this hard for years and years, and that's just not true. Come check it out. We have all these security measures. This is not a concern. And so I would say that it's sort of those two things together, sort of competence in election administration, even in the context of a pandemic, coupled with less of a concern over it's basically attempts to kind of take advantage of these complications like we're talking about in order to undermine the ability of people to vote. And that gets us to your question about voter fraud across the country. So here's the thing. Under current law, and largely even when it comes to just to sort of what's acceptable in politics these days, if somebody is going to try to make it harder to vote, then that person is not, certainly in a court, but even sort of in the court of public opinion, that person really is going to have a hard time saying, I want to make it harder to vote because I don't like those people's votes. Instead, the person has to come up with some reason for why he or she is making it harder to vote. And, and again, I would tag it at about a decade. For about a decade, there has been this sort of common refrain, which is that voter fraud is the concern. Voter fraud is the concern. The problem is, or maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but in this context, the problem is that there is no evidence of voter fraud of any significance anywhere in the country that would in any way sort of justify suppressive voting measures. And so that then leads to, at least for some people, and often for me, for what it's worth, leads to the conclusion that the reference to voter fraud is actually pretextual. The way the courts respond to this varies based on the court that you're dealing with. The US Supreme Court, for the most part, has said, look, if the state says that it's worried about voter fraud, we're going to take them at their word, and they can enact measures in response to that. So that, for people who feel that these measures are not appropriate, that's a pretty frustrating response by the US Supreme Court. That being said, what you actually have now is you have, for example, the Trump campaign and others aligned with the Trump campaign have brought lawsuits saying that states, in a sense, are violating the Constitution by making it too easy to vote. So they're trying to get the federal courts to actually restrict people's ability to vote in different states under the theory that it somehow leads to voter fraud. And we haven't seen how those cases will go through the federal courts yet. But my hope and prediction is that the Supreme Court will sort of see that that's the flip side of the same coin, which is to say, no, we're going to defer to the states on that. And that actually is what I predict.
I'm so tempted to ask you a follow-up question, but I might leave it for later about what happens the day after the election when we have potentially a new Supreme Court maybe addressing a situation around the election, but I'll come back to you on that maybe. I will stick to the Washington State question just with Sara for one last chance to think about the census in terms of how we have performed with regards to the census collection in Washington State, where, as we've heard from Michele and Lisa, things are pretty good compared to the rest of the country.
Right. Well, yes, in terms of self-response, we're ranked second in the country in terms of states.
Who's first? I got to know.
Well, Minnesota.
Oh.
Minnesota has a higher self-response rate than we do, and we're tied with Wisconsin. So we're clocking in right now at 71.9% of our population has self-responded. Minnesota's at 74.7. That still leaves more than 25% in the case of Minnesota with a non-response household. According to the census, we're getting close to completion. So we're at, no state has a complete count yet, but we're up getting close to 99, 98% of the count in Washington. Now, what you should know, I really want to emphasize this because it's not just the count. It's not just a mere count and then we say, oh, we have a count, we have the numbers, package it up, send it off. There is a whole process of, that demographers do, processing and doing data quality checks. And data quality is very important. And right now we are in a place where we are shortchanging that data quality process. So when we will have 3 months to get an apportionment result to the president and Congress, and we need 5 months to do data quality checks to make sure that we actually have an accurate count, and it's especially true for these non-response households. So I don't want to, there are all sorts of issues naturally that come, like duplicates, all kinds of reasons why we need to do data quality checking, cleaning, and preparation of the data. That by shortchanging that process, not only are we going to be, problematic, it just raises those concerns again, like it's not accurate. People are voting more than once. This will be the same thing. People have been counted more than once. So there's going to be, if we don't do it the way we have been trained to do it and make sure that we have an accurate count, we just raise uncertainty about that count, which then takes us into the courts and debates and, very, very challenging.
Wow. So Michele, the pandemic is a crisis, the election's a crisis, and it sounds like the census is a crisis. It feels like such a pivotal moment for America. We're trying to figure out who we're supposed to be, who we used to be, and where this is all going to go. But my favorite philosophical response to all this is all this shall too pass, right? And so what lessons do you think we'll draw from this in 2020 that will affect the next election and the next census, especially when you are doing the work that you're doing and try to figure out what precedents are we setting here by fighting these battles right now?
Well, I think it's really powerful that you said, as you were asking the question, who are we and who have we been, right? because I think the question is, who are we and who do we want to be? The ideals of our country are democracy, which is participation by all people, equality, and we like to put a finer point on that and say equity, whole other lecture, right? Freedom, right? So all of these things, and right now, especially when I hear what Sara's saying about the dangers surrounding not having the quality control around the census count. And then Lisa has talked about, and I'm also well aware of the ways in which voter suppression happens under the guise of a concern about voter fraud. And I say, if these democratic ideals are what we really want to live by, we better wake up and pay attention, because we're not living it if we are going to allow a situation where people who are low income or in rural communities are not going to be counted, or are afraid to be counted because they're afraid someone's going to come and try to deport them, right? Or when people literally cannot get across to vote. You know, in Florida, they just passed this amazing Amendment 4, right? That was about formerly incarcerated people's right to vote. And then the High Court in Florida just basically said, well, now, sure, that's fine, but if you haven't paid your fines and fees, then you still can't vote, which is functionally a poll tax, right? So that's right out of the 50s and 60s playbook that was about preventing certain communities from being able to vote. And I think we really have to pay attention. Do we mean that we want people to be able to participate and to genuinely be included and belong in this country and fulfill the promises of the Constitution, or not? So that's really what I see as the turning point in this moment. And I know what I want, but yeah.
Lisa, the way Michele described things, we really are on the fulcrum, and it sounds like we're going to see a lot of this end up probably in the courts over the next few months and even years. And even, as I mentioned, as we think about the potential composition of the U.S. Supreme Court moving forward, as that seventh position is filled, ninth position is filled. What do you foresee happening based on all the things that are occurring right now in terms of the lessons we're going to draw and how this plays out in the law and in the courts?
Sure. So, I mean, I think one thing that has to be acknowledged is that we don't know how it's going to play out. I think it's easy for people to get pretty worried about things. And actually, I would say, to be perfectly frank, I would say that worry is appropriate. But what I think is not appropriate is panic. And one of the reasons why panic is not appropriate is that it's frankly not productive. It also, so I'm going to make a little connection and come back to it really quickly. What we're seeing now is we're seeing some real sort of erosion of democratic norms, in sort of erosion of sort of democracy generally. And in response to those threats, at least for people who study other countries, for people who study history, in history of the United States, one of the most effective responses to that is actually to not sort of panic or to assume that everything is lost and to kind of go into a shell. It's the exact opposite. Start exercising your rights broadly, start really getting involved, start really caring, start really showing people you care. That's sort of the best bulwark against this sort of erosion. And to that end, you asked, sort of what are we going to take away from sort of what's going on right now? And I will note that every year the Annenberg Public Policy Center surveys Americans' basic knowledge, or their knowledge of basic civics. And these are things like they ask people, can you name the three branches of the United States government? Can you name any right in the First Amendment? And the results of these surveys for years, in my view, have been really troubling. In 2017, a third of Americans could not name a single branch of government. And over a third could not name a single right contained in the First Amendment. So what's my point here? These numbers actually have gotten significantly better. The 2020 survey that they did, people are really paying attention. And so to the extent that people are paying attention and they care about democracy and they understand that you actually, in fact, it's frustrating. Democracy is frustrating. Things go slow. You have to compromise. It's a lot of work. The more people understand that and really start to care about it, that's actually a really good thing.
Well, that's really hopeful, and I love the fact that people are educating themselves around democracy. That's a great way to think about that as we move forward. Sara, I'm actually going to change tack with you because we did get a question from our audience that's very specific to the census, and we'll see how it fits. If we got a new administration, I imagine, a new president, would we redo the census? Is there ever a reason to redo the census in the United States? And I don't know if that's a crazy question, or are you just looking forward to actually answering that?
Well, let me, probably not, but we would probably not redo the whole collection right now. Let me just say I'll just say a few things about that. But one is, we've mostly almost completed the collection. Perhaps a new administration would allow us to do the data cleaning and make sure we have the right numbers and get those numbers done by what was originally planned after the COVID request from the administration back in April, was to have a deadline for the apportionment numbers by April 30, 2021, which would have allowed us to do the cleaning that needed to be done. So I suspect if anything, that might be what happens. Two things to note is that in the continuing resolution, which is right now in the Senate, there is funding for the census, continued funding for the census, which is very hopeful. There's also a bill in the Senate right now for extending the deadline for the census, and it's a bipartisan Senate bill, co-sponsored by Murkowski from Alaska, so for obvious reasons, and others. And then, and I wanted to just say, I really appreciated both Michele and Lisa's point. I think a lot of people really do understand why we need the census. And it says something when you've got, in our state, 72% of people self-responding. Right now, there is a huge bipartisan group of people lobbying and working to get the administration and to get Congress to address the census issue, including U.S. business interests, people from across the spectrum of professional associations, healthcare associations. Everybody relies on high quality census data, and they don't want anything to compromise that. So I agree that I think with Lisa and Michele, there's a lot of people put a lot of trust and faith in these particular institutions of the census and the elections.
All right. Well, I want to take some time to close on the big question, or at least the big question that's in my mind. Well, with input from all three of you, and I'll start with you, Michele. That the origin of the rule of law comes from Magna Carta, 1215. American democracy was a fabulous idea and a shot across the bow in terms of kings not ruling us, but the people who could vote were only white male landowners at the time. And so we've seen this incredible progression and evolution of American democracy in terms of who can participate. And right now, it does really feel like we're at some particular important point where we're going to have to make that decision, as we discussed about what we're going to be and who we're going to be. So my question for you is this, is this really just ongoing growing pains for American democracy, which is this continued experiment in government? Or is this fundamentally a turning point in terms of what American democracy is and what it's represented in terms of freedom and people to the rest of the world?
Well, I think that's a really compelling question. And I feel a little bit like I want to say, well, both, right? I mean, it is an evolution, like it is an experiment, and we have continued to learn and grow. And you're right, at one point, a very limited number of people could vote. And it has taken many protests and many movements to get to where Blacks could vote and Natives could vote and women could vote, right? Like that. So that's evolution. So I do think we're still figuring out how to be a democracy and how to be a country. I also do think it's kind of a turning point. I mean, there's just a lot that is happening right now. I think there's a lot of talk. I really appreciated what Lisa said about the worst thing you can do is panic. And I very much agree with that. I mean, we have our institutions and we need to participate in them first and foremost. So don't say, oh, well, voting looks like it's just all messed up, so I'm not going to do it. Oh, no, that's not the response. Vote, right? Fill out your census form. We need to fight for our institutions. There's a lot of talk that's happening in the media and from various different personalities about, oh, well, voting, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be problems, but we have to stand up for our institutions. And so if it's a turning point, then those of us who care about democracy have to stand up for the idea that we can do this. Our institutions are sound, and we'll fight to keep our institutions sound. I can tell you the ACLU will be fighting to keep our institutions sound. So join us.
Oh, I know you have a great record for fighting. That's great. Lisa, I love how hopeful you have been in terms of thinking about this particular point that we're in, especially with the pandemic sort of creating that forcing function. It's also testing our institutions in that, what do you see? Obviously we're not going to panic, as you said, but how much will our institutions change or grow or adapt, not just to this current situation, but to just as what seems to be an ongoing evolution of American democracy?
That's a hard question to answer. Again, I guess I would say that it makes sense to think about the role that, it sounds so basic, but the role that education and that engagement and that participation all play in dictating which way we go. It's like we keep saying, it's hard work. Now, one thing that you mentioned there is something I think that is helpful to think about, which is this idea that every U.S. citizen should be eligible to cast a ballot. And that's something that, frankly, at this point, we often take for granted. And there are important exceptions to that based on age and residence and felon status and those are all very important. But nevertheless, it's something that tends to connect Americans, is this idea that if you are a citizen, then you get a vote. And one thing that I think is important to think about in that context is that was actually not the idea that we had at the founding, for sure. And in fact, it wasn't really sort of a commonly held belief across the country until about the 1960s, which is pretty recent. And so, despite all of the shenanigans that are going on, despite all the nasty rhetoric that we're hearing this year, it still actually, I keep watching for it, but it still remains sort of legally and I would say politically unacceptable to come out outright and push back against that notion that everybody should be able to participate. And so actually that is progress. And so that's just another sort of, I think, sort of thing to think about when kind of trying to take a little bit of a higher level view of what's going on.
All right. Well, Sara, bring us home. It seems like we're doing our best to end this on an air of positivity. And I'm curious, sort of a derivation of the theme of this question in terms of looking to the future. And you've already alluded to this in terms of the application of technology for people to easily complete the census. What do you anticipate moving forward for our democracy and our ability to use an accurate census in terms of both our political culture and the technology to make it a better world for us?
Well, I really do think that I was actually kind of going in that direction. I think that, we have the census every 10 years. We don't have to have the census every 10 years. If in fact we could afford to do it more often, it probably would be a good idea. And perhaps this online experience, I think I'm not a census person. I haven't talked to the Census Bureau officials who have been doing it. But my sense is that it worked better than they expected, and so there is hope. There is hope that technology might really be helpful, and that we can trust the information that goes into the census and is stored and protected and held confidentially as something that we will continue to value and participate in. So I think it's possible. It could be that online census gathering might even lead to online voting. Who knows? Where we don't have to. I know I saw Lisa roll her eyes. But, making it easier for people to be heard, be seen, be able to be a part of this country. That's what both of these systems are in place for, and have opened up more to be more inclusive. So I'm hopeful. Hopefully that brought us home.
Okay, yeah, that really did. Sara, Lisa, Michele, you've been all rays of light, not just in terms of the insights that you brought to this really difficult question, but you really have given us a sense of hope that our democracy will continue to evolve and grow even when we're going through these challenges right now, both in terms of politics and the pandemic. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. And that's it for this particular fall season of Coexisting with COVID-19. Please do check out the rest of our great lineup at UW Public Lectures. We have a lot of things happening for the rest of the fall. And so you can check that out at the website uw.edu/lectures. And here's one last shot of behind the scenes of the folks who helped put this amazing show together. Right now I've got Richard McLean and Frost Keaton here with me in the studio here on campus, always socially distancing. And we will return for the remainder of season 2 as we come back on January 7th in winter and coexisting with COVID-19 still, but probably in different ways. So we look forward to that and that conversation with you all. Thanks for joining us. I'm Hanson Hossein.